Hey everyone, welcome to Common Christianity. My name's Asher and I'm joined by Aaron Dunn and Zach Fisher. And today we're going to be continuing in our series on church history as we kind of trek down season 2. For those of you that are watching, and eventually you'll listen, those who are listening, you'll notice this too, but Lindsay is no longer going to be a part of the podcast. As many of you know, she does incredible work as a child trauma therapist and really a researcher on the cutting edge in that field. And so she's just had a giant pickup of work. And so we were incredibly grateful for her contributions in season 1 and her contributions in the last episode. But she called me a little bit earlier and said she needed to kind of step away and focus a little bit more on her work because things are picking up. But send her your best, and we send her our best. But before we get into it, how are we all doing tonight?
So far, so good.
Not too
For
bad.
For those of you who don't know, I'm going to out myself real quick. I'm about 15 minutes late getting the link up and the recording, so I'm sorry if this episode feels a little rushed. But all that to be said, Zach, take it away, and let's... what are we talking about tonight?
Well, before we get into that, I just want to let you know that the appropriate authorities have been dispatched to arrest you for the horrible, horrible crime of being 15 minutes late. So this will probably be the last time we see you for a while, Asher. Have fun in prison.
The dogmatic cops are coming after me. I knew it would happen someday.
Sure. You won't notice them until it's too late.
Yeah.
But you're right. And it's a shame that Lindsay won't be here because this might be particularly in her wheelhouse.
Correct.
With respect to some of the story that I'll be sharing tonight. But suffering, boy, that's going to be a happy one, isn't it? And I'm going to do my best not to drag us into the doldrums of this. We're going to be talking about a particular type of suffering. Before we get into that, let me just kind of get our head in the game. A little bit of a rhetorical question, but maybe not. Feel free to jump in. How would you respond to being arrested and sentenced to death just for being a Christian? Let me see if this aligns with maybe some of the thoughts that are going on behind your eyeballs. You might think that's not right, that's not fair, that's not just. And so you are going to do whatever you can do to fight for your rights, to appeal to justice, the justice system. And if the justice system is failing you or failing your companions, your brothers and sisters in Christ, you are going to work to change the laws, to change the system, because Christianity shouldn't be a crime. Let me just stop right there. Does that sound like something you might be thinking if you got arrested, if you got sentenced to death? Your response also might be like, I'm freaking out, But the bottom line is you probably aren't just going to accept it. You're probably going to fight it in some kind of way. Go for it.
Personally, I don't know. This might be like the most jaded answer ever, but it's like, if they come for me, they come for me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm in that camp. And as somebody that works in church, I know there's a lot of people that think that the church is currently being persecuted in modern times. I also know a lot of people that think that the church is much too comfortable where it's at. I've also, personally speaking, I would like to think that I've mentally prepared myself to a certain extent where I'm just kind of like, sure, like to live as Christ, to die as gain, which is kind of like I kind of, like if someone is offended by me being Christian, that's not going to stop me from being their friend.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means they want to, kill me over that, I'm just kind of like, sure, I might like avoid them. It's like, I don't think there's a part of me where it's like, I would appeal justice, but I might run,
Right.
But at the same time, if that makes any sense. So
It does.
So that's my posture on it. I think that's how I would see it, especially with everyone being like, well, the rapture's going to happen tomorrow, and if it's not pre-trib, then we're going through the tribulation and you're going to get shot in the head for being a Christian. I'm of the personal belief that will probably happen in my lifetime to some extent, whether it's the rapture or some form of modern tribulation or a pre-tribulation, like a tribulation before that, some sort of persecution.
So you've thought about it.
Yeah, I've thought a bit about this. I
Yeah.
think when you're being like, oh, like I'm gonna do the human thing and fight, I'm just kind of like,
Mm.
I'm like, I might not, I might do what I can, but at the same time, I might at the same time just be like, it's like if capital punishment, it's like I know who you're sending me to. It's like if I did that myself, I probably wouldn't get there, but because you're doing it, you're actually doing me a favor to some extent. And that's a grim thing to say, but just being honest about that as far as suffering's concerned, I'm like capital punishment. I'm like cool. I'm like fast passes.
Aaron, does any of that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but does anything in what Asher responds there, does that resonate with you as well?
My immediate answer is I would bleed for Christ for sure.
Hmm.
But I also understand that it really depends on the situation. Sometimes God may not want me to just be like, well, just completely jump in and just get shot up if you want to. Maybe there might be a need to actually defend the faith for the sake of a greater cause for others that might need it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just depends on the situation. But yeah, ultimately, if it came to that, I'm prepared for it. But still,
Excellent.
it'll be fear, but that's natural.
Well, yeah. Yes, there might be a change of underwear for all of us if we found ourselves in that situation. I want to commend you both. Okay. You kind of, I don't want to say you passed a test that I was dropping on you. However, I am of the concern that there may be some Christians for whom the response to increasing pressure, increasing suffering would cause them to say, I now need to, this, something's wrong here, something's unjust, and I need to push back against that. In other words, I don't need to just accept it. And again, I may be getting into lanes that I shouldn't be driving in, but my intuition tells me that for those persons, their concern may be for those things that would, what's the word I'm looking for? It would keep them from flourishing.
Hmm.
Right? In America, and that's the context I'm operating in here. For those who might be listening overseas, if that's the case, the idea of flourishing in our culture is just that's the color of the water that we swim around in. Anything that helps us self-actuate, anything that helps us become that which we think we're supposed to be becoming. If anything hinders that, then we have to start talking in terms of like, okay, can we change that, or do we have to change to accommodate that? But the goal of flourishing and self-actualization, to me, my impression of living in America for the past 48 years is just that. It's becoming who you're supposed to become. And anything that stands in the way, well, that's wrong, or that something needs to change. I set things up with that question and that perspective because here's where I want to take this. That question and the way you responded to it is in harmony with the response that I think we find a lot in the early church. But the difference between the early church and, say, the church in America, besides the 2,000 years or the 1,800 years or however we slice and dice it, is what we expect to become.
That's a great premise there.
Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it's a horrible premise. I mean, I'm just not shooting from the hip here, but this is an insight that over the weekend, as I'm putting together the notes, I'm thinking about, okay, how do I maintain the balance between telling these stories of people who suffered a long time ago and bring that into the current context? And to some extent, we've been exposed to the stories of suffering and persecution. We certainly can read it in Scripture. But what I find more often than not is this dramatic response of surrender. To read the martyrs' stories, to read any account of martyrdom, is a study in surrender. And that surrender is rooted in this thought that I am becoming more like Christ. When suffering comes, and all of us will experience suffering, which I'll draw a big circle here and say, suffering are those things that, loss, grief, war, death, all the things that all of humanity experience. But within that circle is a smaller circle. And to me, there's a unique type of Christian suffering that comes about because we are not trying to necessarily become all that we think that we should be. Rather, we are trying to become more like Christ, or at least we should. And when we encounter these stories of radical devotion in a social and cultural context, to me, it's inspirational, but it also is a little bit convicting. Because those places inside of me where I'm like, well, yeah, that's nice. I do want to be like Christ. But as long as Christ plays drums and is successful at it, then that's the kind of Christ I want to become. And that's a very American thing to say.
I agree. Aaron, how does that sit with you?
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. It's in alignment with my faith is in the outcomes of God rather than who he is. Like what he can give me, which aligns with this country's perspective as well, Yeah. What it can give me.
And if I may, Aaron, and Asher, to put some those gutter guards, in the bowling alley. This is not necessarily going to be a conversation about Christian nationalism or the ways in which Christianity has become enmeshed. We certainly can go there, and I want to make sure that what I'm saying here is not that, having dreams and goals and aspirations is somehow sinful or wrong. I don't think either of you have gotten that. But for those sensitive listeners who might be hearing this and going, does that mean then I'm sinning because I want to become the best doctor, or I want to become, the best at something? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying our reactions to whenever something stands in front of us and says, no, you can't do that, and you can't do that because you're a Christian. We don't have a lot of experiences of that in America. We don't. And experiences that I hear oftentimes being said, no, now we're experiencing persecution. Well, when I go back and look at actual persecution, I'm like, no, you just had a bad day.
Yeah.
Somebody told you no. Somebody voted a way that you hoped that they wouldn't have voted. But when we compare it to true stories of persecution, and heck, we don't have to look 2,000 years ago. We might just want to look and peek at another hemisphere today and say, how are they experiencing Christianity where they are from? China, anyone?
Iran, right. Anyone?
Yeah.
Do I hear Somalia?
Yeah, I see that hand in the back.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, to read the stories of martyrs, they seem to call back to me and ask me, okay, Zach, so what exactly are you willing to give your life for if the chips are down? And what exactly are you complaining about? Those are kind of the two things that I get slapped across the face. So while they're inspirational, they're also convicting. And I want to make sure then I counter this by saying the conviction that we feel should be conviction towards becoming more like Christ, not becoming more like the martyrs' stories that we're reading. Let me stop right there. Yeah, go ahead, Asher.
I just had a question about the premise, just as we're kind of setting the table for the discussion. Is it, so we already know that it's not a opposition of who I'm becoming, because who I'm becoming is a very human, very American idea. You're suggesting it's about becoming like Christ, which I think is maybe, pardon me for saying this, maybe on the nose, Christianese, a tad bit. Would perhaps
I'd argue against that.
Well,
I would argue passionately against that.
It's biblical, but isn't there something to be said in just not in the premise of suffering and individualism, but in the premise of God's unique expression for each of us? This is just without getting heated about it, but like just in that I know I probably just touched a nerve, and I'm sorry, but but this is the question. In that context, in the individual expressions of God that we all are, because you obviously are 48 years old, have black hair, and play drums, and I'm a blonde hair dude that's like 28 and has different, our contexts are different, our stories are different. And
Uh-huh.
there's also additional scripture that says there's different types of spiritual giftings. Additionally, there are eyeballs, and there are legs, and there are
Mm-hmm.
arms, and there are
Mm-hmm.
noses.
Mm-hmm.
So then wouldn't perhaps the more accurate, or perhaps a welcome revision to that phrasing be, it's not about necessarily becoming like Christ, it's about becoming what Christ intended us to be, which is like Christ as we are made in his image, which would then also honor our individualism, but then also honor the fact that we are imperfect beings becoming, learning how to live the life that Jesus wanted us to live. Is that an acceptable adjustment to the premise?
Well, more than being fair, I think we're saying the same thing.
Right.
I don't think we're disagreeing in that
Right.
at all. When I say Christ becoming like Christ, and I don't want to necessarily for this thought to die the death of 1,000 qualifications.
Well,
But when I say to become like Christ, of course, I don't mean that now all of a sudden Aaron and Asher and Zach Fisher eventually on a long enough timeline cease to look like the people and sound like the people that we're hearing on the podcast today. But then all of a sudden, like our vocal cords are now exactly shaped like Christ's and we sound just like him whenever we breathe out.
correct. And so
Right.
there's the literal premise, and I think there's that goes all the way to the physical, but I also think there's the legalistic premise that comes with that, which is to say that and I think this is a big bad rap that religion gets, which is uniformity over unity. And I think when a lot of people say, like Christ, there's this huge abuse of dogma, I'll say, which is to say that it becomes a lot more uniform in the way that people look, in the way people sound, the way people think. And I don't think Jesus came to abolish any sort of discourse beyond the fact of the discourse that sin is, supposedly an okay thing, which is not. That's, I think, the only thing he really came to abolish, and its control over us. But I think how we, the different facets, the different cuts that we are of the diamond of, of all creation, I think becoming who we were intended to be by God is also in line with your definition of becoming like Christ. But I think the wording is a little bit easier to swallow because you still get the self-actualization thing with the challenge of sanctification baked into it. And
I may
with
have
me
to
being,
go back and listen to this again get to
You're
really
good.
catch the distinctions of what you're bringing out here. And I don't want to create hills to die on that aren't.
You're good.
Sorry, a little bit of echoing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hold, please.
We're going to wrap up that conversation real quick. My headphones just died. We're going to just keep moving forward. But anyway, becoming more like Christ, becoming more as Christ intended us to be, is kind of the point of suffering, I think, is what you're getting at.
It certainly can be. Yeah, and I think you're right to make sure that we draw a circle around who gets to say when we look like Christ. I mean, there's certainly ways in which we can say, okay, my life is beginning to reflect attitudes and behaviors that are, perhaps better than they were last week and yesterday. But at the same time, there are challenges that we face. There's addictions. There's things that are hard to kick. And our salvation is rooted in who Christ says we are. So when these individuals, or this particular individual that we're going to look at tonight, encounters something that would stand in the way of what anybody else, any other reasonable person in that time would have said, oh, you're living the right life. You've got a good life ahead of you. When that person meets the challenge of persecution, she embraces it, and embraces it in a way that I think is humbling. And I think I used the word before, convicting. So let's not bury the lead too much here. We're talking about persecution, martyrdom stories, and there's a lot that we could choose from, but then again, maybe not as much as we hoped, because there was a cottage industry of martyrdom stories that came out, especially as the centuries moved on. And the more spectacular and more gruesome and more, it was kind of like there was, the Gnostic Gospels. It became harder to kind of figure out, are they actually martyr stories, or are they just kind of puffing things up right? But there are some stories that we could pull from. And so when I thought about tonight, which story would make good sense and be a good launch point for lots of different conversations we could have, I thought, okay, well, we could look at scripture. All right. Jesus, Stephen, James, they were persecuted, they were killed for the faith. That's, we can read that in scripture. And I'm trying to keep us in the first, say, 300 years of the church. Paul and Peter, they died in the first century, but we don't have accounts of their passions. We don't have accounts of, what they actually went through. But we do understand that they were, like, Paul was in prison. And tradition tells us that they both died in Rome, right? So under the Emperor Nero's persecution, and that's the context in which Peter is writing his first Peter, the book of Peter. But yeah, again, I don't have passion accounts to draw that out. Okay, so maybe I go with Saint Ignatius of Antioch. Okay, so that's coming after the biblical period. That's a good story. It's a story of somebody who is in Antioch and they're being arrested and he's being transported to Rome. And as he goes to Rome, he writes books or letters rather to the churches as he's being transported, encouraging them, saying that he's looking forward to what he's about to undergo. He sees this as a high form of devotion. This is him sharing in the sufferings of Christ. He writes to the church in Rome and says, hey, don't stop this from happening. Don't step in the way. Let this happen. That's a pretty, inspirational story, I guess, but I kind of want more drama. I mean, St. Ignatius was very pastoral in the way that which he handled that. I heard and read stories about St. Lawrence. So St. Lawrence was somebody who died in the 3rd century. And what makes his story unique is that there wasn't really so much of persecution going on there per se. But the story goes that he was approached by an official in Rome, and he was a deacon. And this official comes to him and says, hey, I hear that the church has a lot of gold and a lot of silver. Can you maybe show me that? Because I think they have eyes on that gold and silver. And St. Lawrence at the time, he hadn't quite graduated, he responds in effect saying, hey, yeah, the church has gold galore. We have more gold than anyone else in the world, frankly. So tell you what, give me 3 days and I'll collect all this stuff. And then when I get it, I'll ask you back and I'll show it to you. And the guy's like, okay, cool, see ya. When the guy shows up, expecting there to be all this gold and silver, instead what he encounters is St. Lawrence has gone around to the city and collected all the poor, not all, but many of the poor, the sick, the blind, and basically has them sitting out there with their names. And then Lawrence basically says to the official, here's our treasure. Do with it what you will. To say, it's a bit of an understatement to say that the official was not too pleased with that response. And so, St. Lawrence, according to tradition, which actually might be a mistranslation, but he's killed. The manner of his death is described as gruesome, but the fact of the matter is he is killed. He really did exist, and that story really did happen. And it demonstrates a kind of civil disobedience, which is something that's common to these martyrdom stories. There's a little bit of civil disobedience, but that's the story. And if that's the story I chose, then that's tonight's episode, and let's launch on from that. It's a very short story, and you kind of get it, and maybe that is the best story to start with. But again, too short.
Well, death by sarcasm.
Yeah, I think that was probably and a holy kind of sarcasm.
Oh, yeah. No, but I want to be the most literal person in the world now because I don't want someone just killing me because I said a joke. I'm not getting paid.
Right.
I'm not getting paid enough for that. I'm not.
Right.
I'm not a funny person in general. So I'm gonna.
Well, and I think to Lawrence's credit, I think what he was trying to draw a circle around was, hey, Rome, we have a different valuation system.
Yeah, and we cherish the poor. We cherish souls. We cherish people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think I've never heard that story, but I wish the church, from a PR standpoint, was better known for a story like that than the stories we hear from like the last 25 years.
I could not agree more. And to me, I'm glad that you drew out the sarcasm and the humorous aspect of it, because there is that part of it that strikes me as like, you ever have a day at work and you just want to be like, you know what, this isn't the most valuable thing in
Well,
the
at
world
least
to
we
me.
know. Well, we at least we know it's Christian to be a smartass. Like we know that heavenly sarcasm will get you killed. I think we can, in a very reverent but flippant way, say like if you're being flippant to the wrong people for the right reasons and it gets you killed, then huzzah, you're in the St. Lawrence Club.
Right, right.
Which I would love to be in the St. Lawrence Club. My dad is also named Lawrence, so he might be listening to this and he's like, "You're already in the St. Lawrence Club. What are you talking about?"
You better be.
Yeah. So that's another 2 cents there. But just to in the midst of a very very what do you call it, somber episode, I think having a couple of injections of levity, with
Yeah,
all reverence, is I don't think I'm completely out of place with that. And if I do ever cross
not at all.
this episode just being like, no, that was disrespectful, I will take that on the chin and leave it in the recording.
No, we need it. We need
Yeah.
it. Because, I'm going to not necessarily drag us into doldrums. I do think that levity, let's address levity where levity exists.
Right.
Right. And that one is a funny story, especially when you find out later, like people believe that his manner of death, because the official said, I'm not going to make your death a quick one. So tradition holds that he was put onto like a grill and cooked. But the
Maybe we
thing
that's where we
is
get
that
the word
actually
deus.
that's I'm sorry,
Maybe that's where we get the word deus.
I'm not cat. Sorry,
Or
my Latin's bad. Sorry, but there's a translation issue. Something like there was a letter that was dropped off, and if you drop this letter off in Latin, I think it was Latin, it gets translated as he was grilled or he was cooked, when actually chances are he was beheaded. But
Wow.
even that
Yeah.
kind of generated this humorous kind of take on his martyrdom story, because people picked up on that, hey, he was cooked. And so they said they kind of leaned into that, and they said that he responded to his executioners with, hey, I think I'm done on this side, why don't you turn me over? So again, macabre, Galley's humor, call it what you want, but like people jumped on that and they found the humor in it and they used it in a humorous way to kind of, let people know that these are our heroes. But again, probably not really cooked. He probably was beheaded. So St. Lawrence.
We could have, yeah, that's just, I mean, we'll get to meet him someday as saints and things like that, but I mean, just to think you have this incredibly theatric kind of bait and switch protest, this really clever thing, and because it wasn't what you expected it to be, you kill the guy for it. And I feel like that also, to put this back into the more serious vein here, and Aaron, if you want to jump in on this at any point, let me know. But like that's why Jesus got killed. That's why a lot of, you know, pastors and church leaders and people like that kind of get skewered in a lot of different ways. And sure there are moments where when you misrepresent something and it's malicious, but other times you can come in and everyone thought Jesus was going to be the person to overthrow Caesar militarily,
That's right.
and he gets killed for that.
That's right.
Um, they come and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I want all these riches to plunder and to tax the church." No, here's the poor. We're gonna kill you for that. I can think of a lot of people who've tried out the faith and they thought it was going to be one thing and it turned out to be another, and so they leave it. And so this, to bring it back to the more serious tone of this, the subversive has always been very closely akin, a cousin to, a friend of the divine as it works to bring about flourishing. And it can be a funny thing. It can also be a very shocking thing. And I think us in our limited human imagination, we don't either have the mind or the stomach for it. And so when it's just too much to swallow, we just kill the person who handed us the bitter pill. And I think,
Kill the messenger.
yeah, no, legitimately.
Hey, and let's not forget this scripture has a lot of funny stories in it as well. But I will digress, because there's a lot of good funny stories coming
A
out
lot
of.
of juicy ones in there, yep, for sure.
So the story I picked for us to look at tonight is the story of Perpetua and Felicity. or if you look up Perpetua online, you might run into translations that'll Perpetua and Felicitas, but either will work for our purposes today. What I'm going to do in the next few moments, and I'm looking at the time, we're good, okay? I'm going to just give you the some brief, one sentence summation of several important events that happened in her story. If I read it, it's like 13 pages Word document. Not going to do that tonight. But I'm going to try to give you the essence of the story. I'm going to limit my commentary and contextualization just to get through the story so that at least you have a chance to hear it, right? And then, having done that, then I'll go back and I'll point out some things. Actually, what I'm really going to do first, after I go through that, give a moment for reflection, like, hey, what do you hear? What are some things that stand out to you? And then, as time permits, I have certain aspects of that story I like to draw out, certain important details. So that's how we'll proceed over the next little bit here. And if I'm looking at things right, we should have had time for all of this. So the story of Vibia Perpetua, okay? The first thing you got to know about her is she's 22 years old. She comes from a noble family. She's married, and she has a kid who's less than 2 years old. And she is placed under house arrest or legal surveillance, you might call it, her and several of her companions, because they are interested in becoming Christians. So the editor of her diary or her story begins with that much information, and we immediately land with her having an argument with her father. Her father is trying to get her to renounce her faith, and she basically doesn't buy it. She says, no, I'm a Christian. There's nothing else I can be. And very soon after that, she's baptized. And once she's baptized, then she's arrested and she's placed in, her and her companions who all got baptized. They're placed in some squalid conditions. She does not have her child with her at this point in the story. So while she's in this dungeon, she's praying, and she feels the Spirit tell her that she needs to pray for her endurance. While she's in there, two deacons from the church come in and pay to let the prisoners be taken to a better part of the prison for a few hours, okay? Because conditions in there is really hot. There's no plumbing. It's horrible. And then while she's out, enjoying that a little bit better part of the prison, which, by the way, the prison's going to be more like a house than what we might conceive of as a prison in modern terms. Arrangements are made for her to have the child stay with her in prison. And so that concern, that mother's concern, is being addressed and makes it a little bit easier for her. The story goes on then that Perpetua later has a vision, what's called the ladder to heaven. In this vision, she ascends a very dangerous kind of ladder. It's filled with all sorts of weapons. And there's somebody, in the group who's going up in front of her in the ladder, and she's stepping on the head of a dragon. I mean, it's a very vivid vision that she's talking about. And when she gets to the top of this ladder, she meets a figure that we might say is Christ, and she is, she's met. She's given some milk curd to eat, and when she woke up from that, she still tasted the sweetness of that milk curd. And she writes that having had that vision, she then knew that she would be killed in a very short time. From there, she goes on and has a trial before a Roman official. Just before that, her father again tries to plead with her to renounce her faith. She will not. During the trial, her father appears with her son and tries to convince her to renounce, saying, basically, think about your kid. He's pulling on the maternal heartstrings here, but she still will not recant her faith to her own father. And moreover, she will not recant to the official. She says she will not offer incense. She's asked, are you a Christian? She says, yes, I am. And she and her companions are very happy because they are now condemned to go die at the beasts. Now, an interesting thing happens with her child. She's not given the child. Her father keeps the child, but the child no longer wants to breastfeed, and she's no longer in physical pain, so she feels like that's been an answer to prayer. She knows the child's going to be taken care of, and she no longer has to feed him. He's going to basically she saw that as an answer to prayer. Let's just fast forward on that one. She has a vision of her dead brother. Her brother's name is Dinocrates, and she prays for him because she sees him in a place that it's not heaven, but it doesn't appear to be hell either. And there's a huge chasm, and there's a lot of imagery involved here. And he's thirsty, but he can't get water. And so she is very upset by this. She begins to pray for him. And then she writes that she had a vision, another vision soon thereafter, and her brother is now in a better condition and is playing like a child would play. Skip over that. We'll come back to that for some context and maybe some interesting stuff there. While the story goes on, she's still in prison, not yet to the games. She gets a visit from her father. This time, though, the father doesn't try to deconvert her or deconstruct her. He just basically is mourning. But they are beginning to gain the favor of the jailer. And so the jailer, is allowing more visitors, including her father. So, things aren't terrible, but she's still going to die. She has her final entry into this story is then she has a vision of that she is led to the amphitheater and she sees an Egyptian gladiator. And in this dream, she is transformed into and then she fights with this Egyptian gladiator and is victorious. And her interpretation, which she gives, is that she saw that she would not be fighting against man, but she would be fighting against the devil. This was now a spiritual battle. The story goes on and gives us some additional visions from her companions, one of whom is named Satyrus. Felicitas comes in now. Felicitas is her slave. Okay, so Perpetua is a noblewoman. She has a slave named Felicitas, who is also a Christian, who has also been baptized. The thing is, Felicitas is 8 months pregnant. And her big concern is that if she doesn't have this baby, she's not going to be able to join the others when they go into the amphitheater. She'll be killed later with a bunch of criminals and thus lose the glory of dying for Christ. So they all begin to pray earnestly, and lo and behold, she has the baby. And she gives up that baby for adoption to somebody, a sister in the church. So her child has been taken care of. But moreover, Felicitas is happy that she's going to be able to die in the arena with Perpetua, with Satyrus, with the others that have been arrested. Leading up to the games, Perpetua, now she's pretty bold. She chides some of the people for the poor treatment that they're receiving. When I say people, I mean like officials, like jailers and stuff. And lo and behold, they relent. They're like, okay, because she kind of calls them out on the fact that like, hey, when Caesar hears about that you've arrested a noblewoman in this persecution of yours, and then finds out that we haven't been treated very well. I mean, what difference does it make if we go out there fat as opposed to just being scrawny? So he's kind of embarrassed, and he's like, yeah, we should probably treat him more gently and allow even more visitors. And as a result of this, they write that the jailer becomes a believer. As they're preparing for the games, they have a love feast. You could think of this as their last meal, where a bunch of looky-loos come and try to figure out what exactly are these Christians doing. They're somewhat mysterious in some of their practices, but they also know that they're going to die. So if you've seen Gladiator, you've seen the scenes where they all look at the gladiators through the gates and stuff like that. Anyway, Perpetua and her crew rebuke the crowds and basically say, hey, the reason why we're here is because of you. You want to be our friends today, but tomorrow in the arena, you're going to be calling for our death. So they kind of let them have it. Oddly enough, they write that even then some believe after having chastised these looky-loos. From there, things proceed at pace because now we're in the amphitheater, and when they get into the amphitheater, they try to dress them up as priests to Roman gods. That's just the thing that they would do at the games, and they refuse. They said, look, we're here as Christians. We're not going to be dressing up as priests to another religion. And they're like, okay, you got it. The men are joyfully scourged after threatening the Roman official overseeing this. They threaten him with God's judgment, and then the crowd doesn't like that, so they receive some whippings. They're joyful because, again, this is sharing in Christ's suffering, right? Kind of the same thing that we read in Acts. Satyrus is one of the persons that I'm going to skip over him because he is basically avoided by a wild boar. He's avoided by a bear. Like the guy can't die, and then he's attacked by a leopard as he's prophesied. And then once he's been bitten by the leopard, he's bleeding so much that the crowd then begins to mock him with cries of "well washed," or in other translations, "saved and washed." There's basically mocking his baptism. The women, they are being attacked by a cow, which was being used to mock the fact that they were women who just had children. Perpetua survives the attack, the initial attack, and when she kind of comes to, she tends to her appearance. It says that she adjusts her garments. She puts a pin in her hair because she doesn't want to be seen as somehow grieving, you know. And then she goes and strengthens others who have not yet died. Perpetua, though, is wounded. She's not killed by the beast. She's just wounded. But so she and the others who haven't died yet are taken to a specific location in the amphitheater. And that's when the soldier runs them through. Anyone who's not yet dead runs them through with a sword. He initially stabs Perpetua, and she records that she's screaming. And then that's when she guides his blade to her own neck, basically saying, accepting her death. Apparently the guy who was doing it was kind of a young one, inexperienced, but that act of accepting her death and, bringing the sword to her own neck is many of the images that are associated with Perpetua show that. Now, before I hand this over to you and say, okay, big story here, lots of moving pieces here, do let me say, yes, there are several authors within this book or this account. There's an editor. They don't quite know who that person is. It might be Tertullian, but nonetheless, he's not a person in the story. Then there's Perpetua's account. Then there's Satyrus, who has a vision, so that's recorded. And then the events that I just mentioned to, starting from like when she chides the tribune for their poor treatment and things like that. The editor takes back over and basically an eyewitness saying, this is what happened, let me record. So if you're wondering, like, how in the world did Perpetua write a firsthand account of how she got a sword to her throat if she got killed? That's how. There were some eyewitnesses that then they added into this document that survives. And that's the story of Perpetua and Felicitas. Gentlemen, having heard that, what are some things that stand out to you in that story?
I need that moment of silence first.
One thing that stood out to me is that the jailer getting saved, it just reminded me that even if one person gets saved for the sake of my suffering, then it was worth it. And that is what I felt, even though it was so painful, because that's how Christ earnestly feels on an individual level for each one of us, But yeah, just being used like that, even if it was for one person, that's intense. But as it says in Scripture, when someone comes over to the arms of Christ, all of heaven is rejoicing. So it's a beautiful thing, as hard as it was.
Well said. Well said, Aaron.
That's a really tough story. Aaron, you know this. I'm kind of a connoisseur thereof of story. It's kind of, call it a hobby, profession, obsession. Like that. There's no easy way to tell that. And Zach, I'd like to commend you for bulking in as much of the actual weight of that story as you did in such a short amount of time. One storyteller to another. The thing that stood out to me was in the end when you were telling me about how they put the story together. And this is going to be such a movie nerd, movie buff kind of thing of me to say. So this is going to be very vanilla Asher, if anything. But it's like, how did we get this story? The church. It was a collection of eyewitnesses and people who said, we need to remember this. And really, the power of the church, the power of the gospel, the power of the Old Testament is built on that sentiment of we need to remember this. The good, bad, and the ugly thing. I think, for me, that all I wrote down at the end of that entire story as I was kind of like trying to take the notes on it all was the church's power is in its story. And, when we so and so died because of Jesus. It's like, oh yeah, their story ended because of Jesus. And they're, essentially called a martyr. It's like every other point in their life was leading to that moment.
Bingo.
And so, and then everyone is just echoing like they died for this. They died for this. And that story just keeps getting told and told and told. I think the fact that this story was women makes it a lot more difficult to swallow because of the cruelty. Like they're getting hit with angry cows because they were recently pregnant. Like that's like you can see the cruel humor of the Romans in that for doing it that way. But as a Christian, I can also just be like, okay, so we've lived in a society that has not really cherished women or life or anything like that in any regard for any period of time. No, it was shocking. I'm just truthfully, I think I'm actually just traumatizing onto the recording because that was not an easy. I mean, I'll say this. Hearing you say that reminded me of the same feeling I had watching the movie A Hidden Life, which is about a Austrian Christian who is enlisted into Hitler's army who will not swear allegiance to Hitler because he has allegiance to God, and spoiler alert, he's killed at the end of that 3-hour epic. It's one of my favorite films. Terrence Malick, who I more and more as I do more research on that mysterious man, I think he's a Christian. But no, just no, that's one of those ones where it's like, I'll get back to you in a week.
Of course. And that's fair. That's very fair. Having read that story so often, it's not that I've become numb to it. It's just that I've lost the impact of the first time having read because I'm not surprised by the details. I know that they're coming. However, what hasn't changed every time I read it in preparation for this, I'm immensely humbled. Not because Perpetua represents every Christian that we might meet in Carthage. I may have failed to mention that she's in Carthage, but no. But we tell these stories because they are extraordinary. That's news. News is not just, the sun came up today. Well, yeah, well, it always comes up. But what makes this story extraordinary is that it provides a demonstration of, again, like I said at the beginning, these martyrdom stories are a case study in surrender. And surrender, now this is Zach doing modern editorialism, which is dangerous because my opinions don't really count for much. But let me just let me frame it this way. In my own life, surrender is a vitamin I do not take very often. In fact, I avoid it. If left to my druthers, I would manage my own accounts and affairs all the way into the kingdom of heaven if he would allow me to. If I'm honest, I might give you a pious answer, but that, functionally, if you study my life, I am at the switch trying my best to dial the levers in and, do the thing that I think optimize the outcomes. No, Lord, I got it from here. This is the most efficient way. I've thought about it, so you're welcome. And I've already done that. So let me take it from here. The surrender option? Nah, not instinctively. And I said this at the wrap of season 1 when you invited me in. Whenever I begin to despair over the distance between who I know myself to be and these examples that I read, I have to remember, oh wait, it's the same Holy Spirit in them that's in me. And that's the difference maker.
Yeah. Aaron, question for you on this. And Zach, I think that's a great point about surrender and even you sharing how you handle that aspect of our faith. Thank you for that. Aaron, how do you interact with the idea knowing that the same spirit that was in Christ is in Perpetua, is in us? Do you accept that premise? And if you do, how does hearing this story and this conversation on suffering change your view on that?
I don't think it necessarily changes my view. It actually strengthens it. Because when I hear the spirit, the same spirit was in her, was in me, it actually unifies like an account. It's almost like I'm living through almost like the lineage of memories that's existed, that's unified us all since the beginning. And it's a reminder. I guess when I say reminder, it strengthens my faith, because whenever you take time to remember something that God has done, just like the prophets did, which they articulated so beautifully, they'll say, "Oh, great are you, Lord, because you've done this, you've done that, and you delivered us from here and from there, and you provide this every day and that every day." They're remembering who God is, and doing that strengthens your faith naturally. When you remember the things that God has done in your life, just kind of the anxiety and the fear kind of disappears. So when I hear that, it's the same God that operated in that individual, it just strengthens my just consciousness of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
I want to.
Oh, yeah, you go.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
No, I promise not to read too much from the original story, but to cap on what you're saying there, and this comment about, well, it might be putting a hat on a hat, but when, let's see, it was Felicitas who said, I can find it. I know I can find, because she says something, and she's recorded just saying this.
No, you're good. After we do this, I think I have one last thing I'd like to round robin on, and we might end about 5 minutes past Aaron's deadline, but I think it's a quick enough question just to premise it, and then for us to just either nod our heads or say yes or no on some of that. Because something has come to mind that's gripping me recently, I think, as it relates to this conversation on suffering. So, but when you find your piece on it, if you can. If not, I can.
Yeah,
I can throw in.
Yeah, I want to. Revivals are threatened now. Dawn of the city in a prison, and each of the. So it would have been before this. Okay, here we go. All right. So Felicitas, when she is in labor in the prison, there are people who are making fun of her, saying, "Hey, you think you're hurting now? What are you going to do when you're out there in the middle of the Colosseum?" And this was her answer to them that's recorded, end quote.
Why don't we share any of these stories in church? Why don't we do that? Why? Even just quotes like that. I mean, like Aaron, that's as eloquent as any, you know, theology that I've heard, and it echoes proper theology, at least as you and I would probably find consensus on. I want to say this, and this is going to be me getting on my little soapbox very quickly. If the same spirit is in us in the church, I would have a hard time thinking we actually know what that spirit is and leaning into it. And I will put it very simply, and this is going to be me getting a tad political, but I think you have churches that lean left, you have churches that lean right. And what I'm seeing from the institution, not from the movement of Jesus followers as a whole, but what I'm seeing from the institutionalized concoction that we've made to try and organize ourselves and the leaders and the admin thereof, is this pursuit of comfort to avoid this kind of persecution. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of a book called Shepherds for Sale. Great book. I'm on chapter 3 at the moment, and it's rocking my world a little bit. I'd also like to say this: you have these. That's more of an indictment of the left. I would say to keep this fair, there are people on the right, and Zach, I think you know a couple of the people that are on my short list when I say that. Some of them may have been in the news recently, but I'll tell you later. But there's also the other side, which is more what the left would call Christian nationalism, which, as I've taken a deep dive into that, the goal of Christian nationalism is not seats in Congress. It is not seats in the Senate. It's not even the presidency. It's not seats on the Supreme Court or any of the circuit courts of appeal. The rhetoric that they use is akin to more about overthrowing democracy in favor of a Christian theocracy, similar to that of like Byzantine or the Holy Roman Empire, or even modern day examples like Iran, but make it Christian. Just slap a Chick-fil-A logo on it and there's the United States of Christendom. Whereas that's what's happening on the right. On the left, you have church leaders that would much rather embody Judas as opposed to Jesus in selling out the faith for a buck or for popularity. In both cases, they're avoiding persecution, and I think it really breaks my heart, because if we're really Christians and we believe that the same spirit that was in Jesus that allowed him to endure the cross and to die and to rise again, then isn't a little harsh political discourse or persecution just, pardon the wordplay, but par for the course? Like, isn't that something we should expect? So for me, I don't know why the institution and its leaders are constantly chasing comfort and modeling that to the laity, to the common people, when we have stories like this that say, yeah, like the feds could show up at our door with a gun, and truthfully, it's, instead of quote unquote putting the sword to our own necks, we could put the guns to our own heads and be like, it's okay. But I see, as far as suffering's concerned, Christianity does not have a, as I know it today, it does not have a proper theology of suffering that embraces the stories of what's come before us. If I'm looking at it from my perspective, and that's Asher talking, and that's American Christianity as well. I would say you go anywhere outside of America, heck, go to Canada. I had the privilege of speaking with a pastor in Canada. They're persecuted like heck. Like, you wouldn't believe it. Um, and I'm just like, I asked this pastor, how do you do it? And he's just like, it's just how we do it. It's just normal. A church is, maybe 10 to 12 people. The pastor is supported by, a smaller than 10% tithe. And I have 5 different jobs in software because Canada's unaffordable at the moment. But I'd rather do that than not spread the gospel. And I'm just like, I'm like, okay, he's probably a better Christian than a lot of people I've met in my life. And so just, that's my observation. That's also a story. But I would say we have a very perverted theology of suffering. And I know I'm going to go over for time a little bit. But Aaron, Zach, how would you respond to that premise of, am I too off the mark there? Am I being too harsh to the way things are? Am I off base there?
I really want to hear Aaron before I start yammering. But Aaron, if you need a moment to collect your thoughts, by all means, I can yammer too.
I mean, I just have a short answer. I usually call it cafe church, is what I kind of call it. That's kind of what we've conditioned ourselves to. Just, I mean, we all know, we all kind of experience it, we all see it. Just the comforts of life, easy shortcuts. Society in general has been conditioned to instant gratification, all that, and we kind of adopt those values. But it all stems from fear of society, fear of people. You question why churches don't speak certain things, and I've said this many times. It's just fear of the consensus. Of, what I boil it down to is there's just a lack of standing for what's honest. Many things in the Bible never get spoken of in church because it might be too scary, too gruesome, too intense.
Too boring.
But I'm just saying, being honest is walking in truth.
Yeah.
Walking in truth is being honest. And a lot of people don't want to do that because they fear they might lose, the many few, because it just doesn't make me feel good, And so, but as we're talking about suffering doesn't feel good.
And the hard message is, man, like...
But, it's kind of like what I said before. It's like, the goal, the purpose of it, the journey. It's like, even if it was to save one person, then it was worth it, you know? But many of us don't think that way. A lot of times we're not conditioned to think that way. So that's kind of my quick
Yeah. No, and I mean, even your
understanding
point
of that.
emphasizes that the problem's even worse than I was even saying it was. Like the church is not conditioned even to take a sermon that persecutes their perception of the status quo. Anyway, so thank you for that, Aaron. I'm just like, whoa, maybe it's worse than I thought. But Zach, how would you, considering all the time that we're kind of running up against, how would you wrap this up, and how would
Well,
your response to that be? And what solution might you suggest for some of that?
solution, more suffering. A Anglican pastor a long time ago said something I never forgot. You can tell a lot about what a church values by what they put in the middle of the room. Think about it. When you step into the sanctuary of any church, take a look at what they put in the periphery, but more importantly, what do they put in the middle of that church? Now, hold on to that thought, because many years ago, my mom was sick and she could have died. And like any of us, I went to my Christian friends and asked for prayer on that situation. My mom is suffering. She's in another state. I can't be by her side. My sister's having to pick up a lot of slack. I've never had to deal with this before. What am I supposed to do? God help. And of course, like any Christian, I'm going to go to my friends. And it just so happened, this was not a scientific experiment. I just asked two group of Christian friends that I had. One group responded to heard my story and said, "Oh, Zach, that's horrible. I'm so sorry that's happening to you. We're going to pray, and we're going to pray for your mother's healing." And I was glad to hear that. And I was, and I am. The other group, when I told them that, and this was a church that I did not go to, a denomination I do not belong to, after I told them, they said, "Yeah, we'll pray for you." And then after the service was done, if memory serves correct, they grabbed me, drugged me into a room on the side of the sanctuary, got into a circle, and prayed for my mom that she would be healed. And I appreciated that. But here's the kicker. Then in the middle of that prayer, towards the end, they said, "And Lord, if your will is to not heal her, be with us and comfort us." You could have blown me over with a feather. Am I hearing what I think I'm hearing? For the first time, I am standing around a group of people who actually have a space on their bookshelf for suffering, for things not working out the way I hoped it would be. And is it any surprise to you if I told you that the group of people that I asked for prayer on the first side of things were, you might put into the category of certainly Protestant, certainly evangelical, certainly quasi-charismatic, not word of faith, but, and that the group that prayed and included suffering and death as part of the prayer were Roman Catholics. So now, let me wrap that back to my initial statement. If you walked into their sanctuaries, what do they have in the middle of the sanctuary? Chances are, the churches I go to, it's a big LED screen.
I know the one you're talking about.
And many's like it.
Yep.
The entertainment is in the middle of the room. You go to a Catholic church, you go to a Presbyterian church, you go to a high church, chances are you're going to have a pulpit, you're going to have the altar where the elements are prepared, and specifically in the Catholic Church, you're going to have a crucifix. You're going to have a cross with a Jesus dying on it. So my answer to the fleshing out of my initial response to how do we fix this? Well, we don't fix it. The church is God's problem. More suffering probably would help us understand how to handle more suffering, because it's like swimming in sex. You can read as many books as you want about it, but until you do it, you don't know jack squat. Right? But when the church makes space in its theology, in its liturgy, and in its prayers for the reality that this life on this side of the veil just might not turn out the way we had hoped in certain circumstances, but that's okay, reinforces, to me at least, and I know how I felt in that moment in that little chapel in that Catholic church, that the faith and the God that I subscribed to was big enough to handle my mom dying. And that's what I needed too. I needed prayers for the healing, and I needed to know that God was big enough to be there if that didn't happen. And that's how I answer that question.
Well,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
yeah.
I mean, that resonates with me very strongly.
Mm,
It's like what I was saying earlier. When I remember the sufferings that I've gone through in my life, it only leads me straight back to God. It just leads me straight to you, Lord, because my faith is strengthened in remembering the things that you've walked me through. So I thank that, man. I appreciate that, because that's exactly what I feeling from this.
yeah. I will wrap us up with this one thought. If I'm not mistaken, Romans 5:3-5. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, character hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into the hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. So, with that, we'll see you on the next one, everybody. Have a great night.